Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a completely different and frankly fascinating look at the world's most complex conflicts. We're going to demystify the escalating tensions across the globe using a really brilliant framework recently laid out by Professor Jiang. You see, instead of just reacting to random daily headlines, we are going to map out the world using a geopolitical chess analogy. This helps us truly understand the grand strategies driving the major powers right now. And a chessboard is literally the perfect analogy for geopolitics because in this arena, every single move provokes a calculated countermove. It's this game of ruthless geometry where absolute defense is impossible, and figuring out your acceptable sacrifices is really the only way to secure an ultimate victory. All right, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the rules of the global chessboard, then look at US and Russian strategies, dive into the Greater Israel Project, map out Iran's counter-strategy, and finally, look at the impending endgame. Section 1. The global chessboard and the rules of the game. Real quick, if you want to keep making sense of these incredibly complex global moves, make sure you subscribe to this channel, Conflict Explained. It really helps us keep bringing you these deep dive decodings. Okay, let's dive into this and map out a nation's architecture using a standard chess set. In Professor Jiang's framework, the king is a nation's political system. Think democracy or autocracy. Now, the king doesn't do much of the actual fighting, but it's the fragile core that absolutely must be protected. Then you have the queen. She's the most powerful piece on the board, and she represents the nation's grand strategy, their ultimate, non-negotiable national goal. Next are the attack vectors, which are your rooks, bishops, and knights. These are the specific strategic tools they use to execute that goal, like stealth military attack or dominant financial systems. And finally, the pawns. In grand strategy, pawns are often smaller allied states or global infrastructure networks. A major power is entirely willing to sacrifice a pawn, let an ally take a hit or let a trade route get severed, if it means protecting their king and advancing that all-important queen. Section 2. Superpower strategies, the US and Russia. Looking at the kings of the board, Jiang points out that the US political system, democracy, is highly vibrant and deeply creative, but its ultimate weakness, severe internal polarization. So the way an adversary defeats the US isn't through some direct military invasion, it's by pushing that existing polarization into total civil paralysis. On the flip side, Russia's king is an autocracy. The huge advantage there is that it's incredibly decisive and capable of unwavering, decades-long planning. But its fatal flaw is the succession crisis. If the autocrat falls, the entire system risks a total overnight collapse. So what is the US's grand strategy? Its queen. According to Jiang's reading, it's Fortress America. The core goal here is to absolutely secure the Western Hemisphere while maintaining a state of divide and rule globally. And what does divide and rule actually look like in practice? Well, it means if Europe is bogged down fighting Russia and the Middle East is locked in perpetual proxy wars, the US remains the undisputed global hegemon just by supplying the weapons, the capital, and the resources from a very safe distance. To pull this off, the US uses three main attack vectors: unmatched aerial and tech supremacy, the dominance of the US dollar, and a massive global media apparatus to dictate the narrative. And their pawns in this stark geopolitical math, those are their forward-positioned allies in Europe and Asia. Now, turning to Russia, Jiang refers to their queen strategy as the Third Rome. To really get this, we have to look back at history. Moscow essentially views itself as the spiritual and political successor to the Roman and Byzantine empires. So their ultimate goal is to unite the Orthodox Christian world and build an impenetrable Eurasian alliance that completely neutralizes American sea power. Their attack vectors are totally different from America's. They rely on their massive, seemingly invincible geographic size to just swallow up advancing armies, their intense religious galvanization, and fielding the world's most relentless land artillery. Their pawns? Their infantry. Russia has this historical tolerance for high-casualty battlefield attrition, basically absorbing massive losses to eventually grind an opponent down, that modern Western nations just do not have. Let's move to Section 3, the Greater Israel Project, a deep dive. We constantly hear about regional conflicts on the news, right? But we rarely hear it defined strategically. So, applying this framework, what exactly is the Greater Israel Project mentioned by Professor Jiang? What is their queen, their ultimate grand strategy? Professor Jiang points out that this strategy is deeply rooted in biblical interpretation. It's an ideological foundation that views the entire Middle East as inherently belonging to them, stretching all the way from the Nile to the Euphrates. So from this analytical perspective, it's not just about border security, it's about fulfilling a religiously driven territorial mandate. Think about the sheer geographic scale here. We aren't talking about tiny buffer zones. According to Jing's framework, this expansionist strategy aims to absorb massive swaths of territory across the Middle East. Just picture the map, starting at the Nile River in Egypt, stretching all the way across to the Euphrates in Iraq. It encompasses Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, reaches deep into parts of Saudi Arabia, and even pushes up into parts of Turkey. Jing notes that players running this maximalist strategy view current localized conflicts not as isolated events, but as deliberate stepping stones toward eventually bringing these ancient territories under their ultimate influence. But what about their king? Well, Jane points out that Israel's political core is a really fragile mixed system. On one hand, you have Tel Aviv. It's fast, innovative, secular, acting basically like a modern democracy. But then you have Jerusalem. It's slower, more rigid, operating much closer to a historical theocracy governed by ancient religious law. While this dynamic mix does create unbelievable economic and tech creativity, it also causes severe internal fractures. They are fundamentally divided from within, which is a massive vulnerability on the global chessboard. To execute this Greater Israel project, they rely on three incredibly effective attack vectors. First, Mossad, which the framework describes as the world's most powerful intelligence agency for systemic infiltration. Second, a highly influential global business network through the diaspora. And third, and this is arguably the most crucial for blocking counterattacks, is the political backing of Christian Zionists in America. This is a super unique vector because this political base supports expansion not necessarily for immediate economic gain, but because it aligns perfectly with their own theology of the end times.
Section 4. Iran's counter-strategy, the fortress.
Here, Professor Jiang outlines Iran's queen strategy. And again, this isn't just about localized self-defense, it's a religiously fueled, highly maximalist mission. Their grand strategy is to completely displace Saudi Arabia's influence, defeat what they call the American Great Satan, and ultimately become the absolute leader of the entire Muslim world. So what makes Iran such a tough opponent on the board? It comes down to highly specialized attack vectors. They don't fight conventional wars. Instead, they use the axis of resistance, a decentralized network of proxy forces. They strictly use asymmetrical warfare. Think about cheap drones. They allow a nation to completely bypass multi-billion-dollar defense systems, bleeding out wealthy adversaries. They also control critical economic choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz. But their ultimate defense is their topography. Jiang describes Iran as this massive, invincible mountainous fortress. It makes standard American shock-and-awe land invasions practically impossible, without taking devastating losses. Which brings us to Section 5, the impending endgame, where these grand strategies finally collide. Okay, let's look at this final matrix. We've laid out the pieces. Now imagine what happens when these four grand strategies are forced to share one shrinking global board. Let's walk through it. The U.S. requires perpetual global reliance on its dollar and energy to maintain hegemony. Russia fundamentally needs a secure southern flank and Eurasian integration to protect its king. Israel's strategy requires massive regional territorial conquest, and Iran's strategy requires the complete expulsion of the U.S. and Israel from that exact same region. Mathematically and strategically, these four maximalist strategies absolutely cannot coexist. Achieving the victory condition of one literally means destroying the core objectives of all the others. And because these grand strategies cannot compromise, because nobody is ever going to just sacrifice their queen, Professor Jiang places the probability of these overlapping conflicts escalating into a full-scale World War III at near certainty, specifically an 80 to 90% probability. Which brings us to a pretty stark realization. As this geopolitical chessboard catches fire from these unyielding strategies, the ultimate question isn't how you or I are going to stop it. The forces are just too vast. The real question is, as these massive global structures shake, how will you and your local community build the human resilience and the practical preparedness needed to weather the storm? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and we will see you next time.